International, and I'm the head of policy of our international food program. And if I talk about food, and I'm all the days because I think the food made it to the COP. It's the first time that we have a COP where we have 4 pavilions. We have our Panda pavilion where we have a series of events on food. And food is in the climate context. And that's important because food is causing, and food production is, and consumption is causing about 30% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And we won't achieve a 1.5 target if we will not reduce the emissions from food systems. And one of the levers, and this is a very important one, are the nationally determined contribution, which have been decided 2015 in the Paris Agreement, and they are mandatory. And I think that's really important. They are mandatory to fulfill for the member states. WWF has started to bring this on the agenda to look at how food systems are reflected in the NDCs. And we had a first assessment in 2020 where we were looking how production, food loss and waste, and consumption are considered in the overall NDCs. At that time, we have to admit that food was not really well respected. There are still gaps, and all the targets and measures have not been ambitious enough. What we want to show you today is an updated assessment, and I'm very happy to have Hasib today with us. We have an updated assessment. We have assessed all the new and updated emissions, and you will learn more about. And I'm now slightly optimistic that food also made it into the NDCs. And I want to introduce our first speaker, Hasib Akhtari. He's the senior consultant of Climate Forest, and by the way, this is a joint event with Climate Forest also. Climate Forest is an international think tank, and Hasib is, I think, after 2 years working with us and working with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, he is really an expert on NDCs. And Hasib, over to you to present us the results of this updated NDC report.
Thank you so much, Martina. Thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. We don't have a huge crowd, but I hope some people keep coming in as they see me speak. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. How is the food this year in COP? Have you had a chance to eat anything?
What food?
Exactly, right? I haven't eaten anything for the past 2 days here. But you see the queues, right? The lines. Hundreds of people queuing to get a sandwich. That's really expensive. But when I walk around and look at these people, it makes me wonder how important food is for everyone, for all living beings, but especially for us as humans. It's the one thing that is so specific to cultures, but at the same time cuts across cultures, cuts across boundaries, borders, cuts across regions, and brings us together on so many occasions. Whether it's religious occasions, we sit together, eat. Whether we are in a canteen, we get together, eat. Wherever you see a bunch of people, it's usually that they are going there to eat together. And at the same time, it makes me a bit sad that we kind of have overlooked and kind of taken for granted the importance of food. Because when we look at today's state of our food sector or food systems in general, we see that, as Martina said, a third of global emissions is because of how we produce, distribute, transport, and consume food. We lose a third of the food that we produce before it even is consumed. And every year, almost 1 billion tons of food is wasted, causing so much emissions. And at the same time, there are more than 3 billion people who don't have access to healthy food, to healthy diet across the world. I think this is madness. And that's why what Martina said earlier, that was so important for us as a community who takes action on climate change to bring the food and climate together, because I think the food crisis and climate crisis are two sides of the same coin, and we need to look at both at the same time if we want to achieve food security, if we want to address climate change, whether it's climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation. And over the past several months, together with WWF and the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, we looked at this issue and at how NDCs feature food as an important topic and how food systems measures are included in these national plans for climate action. And now I'll be talking a bit about the results and the findings of these two reports that we prepared, one with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food and one with the WWF International. The first one, that's unlocking and scaling climate solutions in food systems. It's an assessment of NDCs. So why a food system approach to NDCs? As Martina said, NDCs are the most important mechanism under the Paris Agreement to really achieve the 1.5-degree goal. And it brings all the ambitions, targets, plans of what each country is going to do to achieve the 1.5 degree. And food systems provide a huge potential for achieving that. As we see, this is a latest research by Conservation International, and WWF was involved in it as well, where they kind of calculated that 80% of the mitigation opportunity available in the land sector is closely linked to food. So there are, as you see, gigatons of potential for carbon emission reduction across different activities in the food sector, food systems. What we did for our first report with WWF was we assessed all 134 updated NDCs up to the end of September this year, and that's from 160 parties if we include EU NDC for the EU 27 members. And what we did was compare these NDCs to their previous versions or the previous NDCs of the same parties to the Paris Agreement. Some of the findings. A positive finding was that food is now prevalent across NDCs. So you get mentions of food-related measures, food security, food for mitigation, food for adaptation, across most NDCs. And it's improving. The green countries have improved how they reflect food in their NDCs. The orange ones, where the reference or the mention or the integration of food system measures have declined, and the yellow, where things haven't really changed. But the positive thing is most countries do include some measures for food system transformation. That was a positive message. And when we look at various components of or stages of the food value chain, we have different findings. So if we look at the food production or sustainable food production, including agroecology, sustainable or smart, climate smart agriculture, or sustainable aquaculture, we also see some positive trends. For example, 54 updated indices include adaptation measures for sustainable aquaculture compared to 35. That's a big jump in the past few years, and that's a positive trend. But we want more than that. We want most countries that rely on aquaculture as part of their food systems should include, because we know most aquaculture systems are at risk from climate change impacts, and we need to make them more resilient and take adaptation measures for them to provide enough food, aquaculture and aqua food for future. Similarly, if we look at agroecology as a holistic approach to how we produce food that's good for environment, for health, for the well-being of local communities. Previously only 11 countries or parties included, but now 15. It's not a big jump, but it's a positive trend nonetheless. And if we look at agroforestry, also a system where forest and food production are brought together, where we have trees for fruits and we have crops for various types of food items, we see a good and positive trend from 49 previous indices we have now 70 NDC or parties, including agroforestry as a key adaptation or mitigation measure under the NDCs. When we look at food waste and food loss and sustainable diets, two key components of food system transformation, there is some positive trend, but it's nowhere close to what we want. We see that now more countries include food waste and food loss in the NDCs. A lot of them are, for example, 36 updated NDCs include post-harvest food system measures. That is introducing cold storage, introducing refrigeration, introducing shortening of supply chain and transportation to ensure food when it leaves the farm is not lost, basically. And this is a key problem in a lot of developing countries where they don't have the technology, the transportation available to avoid food loss. And they are introducing a lot of measures to achieve food loss reduction. At the same time, 19 updated NDCs include explicit measures on reducing food waste and food loss compared to only 2 NDCs. And one good example is the United Arab Emirates, where they have included a quantified target of halving food loss and food waste in the country in the most updated NDC. And we have other good examples like Costa Rica. They include reducing food waste and food loss, and also introducing guides for how to transition to more indigenous diets and more indigenous food to ensure a good and healthy diet for the population. Unfortunately, diets and shifting diets still remains an area for concern. We don't have a lot of countries introducing measures, and only 5 countries include dietary-related measures, and all of them are developing countries. While diets is a huge problem in developed countries, where a lot of food is wasted, and there's a lot of only heavy meat consumption or meat-heavy diets, basically, not a diverse diet where a lot of other pulses, vegetables are included. But these developed countries lack any measures for transitioning to sustainable diets and healthy diets in their NDCs. A caveat here is that they might have it in some national level policies, which we didn't look at. We looked at NDC, but we push for including any good measure that countries are planning or implementing to be included in NDCs, but because that's where we see actual ambition, actual plans of countries when we look across countries and around the world. And only 1 previous NDC included dietary measures. We also looked at the types of ecosystems that were considered in the NDCs, because ecosystem conservation and resilience, building of ecosystems and adaptation in ecosystems is tightly connected to food security, food production, and sustainable food value chains. And we see that a lot of countries include forests, agriculture, wetlands, marine and coastal ecosystems, savannas, even urban landscapes. And the trend is positive. We see more countries considering adaptation and resilience of ecosystems, and also climate change mitigation action for ecosystem conservation. However, the negative, or the rather not so positive message or finding is that most NDCs still lack a holistic, a more comprehensive approach to addressing food system issues and transforming food systems. Only 19 updated NDCs include both sustainable food production and reducing food waste and food loss in their NDC. So most countries include one or the other, not all of these measures that we need to take simultaneously. And 5 NDCs include measures for food production and food consumption. And only 2 NDCs actually include all measures for all different stages of the food value chain and various components of food systems for food system transformation. We need a lot more countries to do across all these key measures. And we also looked at some of the equity considerations when it comes to food, because food is as important for climate as it is for livelihoods, for lives, for health, and for the well-being of farmers and local communities. We looked at how NDCs include measures for IPLC inclusion and the food system related measure planning and implementation, things have improved a bit, but still less than half of the countries include anything on in their indices about IPLC and how they play a role in transforming food systems. Smallholder farmers are more included, and measures for improving the livelihoods of smallholder farmers for food system transformation is also included more in the indices, but still not nearly enough. Food security is increasingly becoming a key issue, again, mostly in developing countries, where food security has always been a problem, but previously it was mostly a developmental problem. Now they are increasingly connecting it to climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, which is a positive trend. Based on our analysis and previous assessments and studies, we came up with a few high-level recommendations. At the global level, to transform food systems, we need to shift to nature-positive food production, reduce food waste and loss, increase circularity in food system. We need to transition to healthy and sustainable diets. For these to happen, really, we need to collaborate across sectors, across stakeholder groups, and across levels of governments. And especially specifically for the countries who make or develop the NDCs, and for organizations who support these countries, we need them to include more measures for food waste and loss, for consumption, and for including IPLC, women, youth, and other marginalized groups. Maybe I'm running out of time. No one is telling me, so I'll go a little faster. The second assessment that we did was with the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, where we looked at climate finance, and specifically public climate finance, and how it is directed to transforming food system. Some of the findings are eye-opening. Like I mentioned earlier, a third of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food, and at the same time we are directing $528 billion every year as subsidies, as support from governments to the agriculture sector without any criteria for environmental protection or emission reduction or climate change adaptation. It is just to mostly harmful agricultural activities. Less than 1% of this $528 billion has actually an environmental objective. We also looked at how public climate finance is channeled to food system. Looking at the OECD data, we disintegrated that into different buckets based on the objectives, and we found that from all the finance that's going for climate change mitigation and adaptation, only 3% is actually for food system measures or projects that have an objective to transform food systems. The rest usually goes to other sectors such as the transport and energy, which receives $210 billion, and also for other sectors, $101 billion. We also looked at NDCs and to check how much money in the NDCs of the developing countries is allocated for measures that's relevant for food systems, both climate change adaptation in food systems as well as mitigation. And we found out that $263 billion actually doesn't have a clear objective. Most NDCs mention we need this much, or we allocate this much for implementing our NDC, but the objective is not really clear. And we also found out that only 14 billion, or 4% of the total 358 billion across NDCs, is allocated for measures or programs, activities that's relevant for food. This is either food system climate change mitigation or adaptation. But most money goes to energy, transport, waste, and other sectors. However, more than half, it's still unclear where the money is going to be spent in NDC implementation. This was also eye-opening. We realized that a lot of NDCs don't actually allocate enough money for food system actions. At the same time, they also aren't clear about the money that they need or the money that they want and how they want to spend it. So we came up with a few recommendations for both policymakers as well as donors and investors. And I need to say here that for this assessment, we also talked to multilateral banks that that channel climate finance to developing countries. We also talked to international NGOs, and we also talked to government representatives. And these recommendations are based on those interviews. And yeah, I won't go through all of them. Probably I'm almost out of time. Do I have time? But for policymakers, we are asking to include clear finance asks in their NDCs and make sure that they clearly mention what sector it's going for and whether it's relevant for, whether it's going to any food system measures or not. And we also ask the policymaker to include clear indicators, milestones and targets for how they use the finance, and so that they can monitor the use of that finance and also report on that. Also accounting for the true costs and benefits of investments in building sustainable food systems need to be considered in NDCs, and measures to minimize externalities and risks, such as if we take climate change action, we make sure that trade-offs are minimized and the livelihoods of local populations are not affected. Donors need to increase funding, of course. A lot of funding goes to mitigation actions. Less funding goes to adaptation, which needs to be increased. And they also need to assess their funding and investment portfolios to make sure that more funding actually goes to food system transformation and less to climate change mitigation actions that could be actually harmful for food sector systems. That's it. Thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions, later.
Thanks a lot, Kasib, and thanks also for pointing out the linkage to the finance. I think all these measures and targets, without financial support, they will not be or could not be implemented. And what is important is really to get from just actions, just pledges and commitments to actions on the ground, and just to point out that only 3% of the climate finance is going to food system. Hopefully this will change in the future. And I would like now to ask my panel, and I have a great, excellent panelists to get to the stage. Julia Wolf, I just name you, just get to the stage, and then I will introduce His Excellency Esa Al-Hashmi. And Veronica, happy to have you again in our panel, please. And Freeman, where is Freeman? Oh, he's already there. So let me just start to introduce our short introduction of our panel. Julia Wolf, she is the National Resource Officer in the FAO's Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment. She is also the FAO Global Program Coordinator for scaling up climate action on land use and agriculture through NDCs and NAPs, so you are an expert on this topic. And she was also involved in the integration of agriculture in the national adaptation plans. Let me start with the first question to you. FAO has done a lot on NDCs and adaptation, and also on your knowledge on what you do with Scala. Could you explain a little bit how FAO is supporting member states in enhancing their NDCs in the food system transformation sector?
Thank you so much, Martina, and good morning, everybody. It's a noise challenge we have at the COP, I guess. So I'm really grateful to Climate Focus to go through the statistics, because that's normally the main job FAO does, but you've done it already. So I would say I agree with most of the data, but let me comment on it also quickly before I say something on what we do with FAO. So, I mean, we have to understand that NDC is happening in cycles, no? So 2015, as you know, with the Paris Agreement, it's the first generation of INDCs that then turned into NDCs, no? So what we find there is already like a high incidence of countries in terms of outlining their priorities for agriculture and land use. No? So this is how we talk about food systems in a traditional way. Then we have the next generation, as we sometimes say, the revised NDC, which has the deadline of 2020. In some cases it's 2021 because of COVID. And there you have a higher incidence, and again, thanks for the statistics on food system. No? So now one of the ambition setting is in theory through this dialogue and also inspired through a lot of work that went into the UN Food System Summit, that the next generation of NDC in 2025 will actually pick up this wording more substantively. And why is that relevant? Because if you just look into sustainable production system, you kind of forget the socioeconomic dimension of it. No? So food system is many things, no? But it broadens the scope out, saying it's not just the production, it is actually the livelihoods of the agriculture, forest, fishery dependent livelihoods, no? Which in FAO terms is 2.5 billion people. No? So we talk a lot about a lot of producer, a lot of smallholders, pastoralists, they have many different names. So that's kind of the first point I want to make. FAO, we have a new strategic framework, which is from 2022, so this year to 2031, where we have a very, very clear mandate in terms of supporting countries in combating, so addressing climate change impacts, and with a focus on the least vulnerable countries. So that's LDCs, it's landlocked countries, with the assumption that climate change goes hand in hand with the SDGs, and we should leave no one behind. No? So overall, FAO at the moment supports countries on NDC kind of updating, but also kind of helping to come up with an operational plan to understand what are really the country priorities, what is the national budgets that are allocated to these priorities, and what are the international financing gaps. So I agree, Martina, with the importance to linking the NDC kind of statement of the countries. I mean, this is what countries, parties, and I'm sure you can confirm that. That's your ambition setting. But it all can only happen if there's enough means for implementation available, which means not only finance, it means capacity building, it means transfer of technology, and it means finance and also partnering, right? So the NDC partnership is here, so I also wanted to say that we think it's very important, a very important partnership, and we collaborate with. Last but not least, on FAO support, we just also have revised our FAO strategy on climate change, which again has a very clear focus on country support on NDC, but also on national adaptation plans. So these two instruments are really key for country support, but we are also like dialoguing a lot with countries in this COP. Also with the Cornevia joint work on agriculture negotiators to make sure that the wording is increased wording. So that means not just agriculture and land use, it means agri-food systems, it means healthy diet, it means many more things that can be kind of put into the equation. So I keep it here.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you also for pointing out that the implementation is at the national level, and at the end it depends on the capacity, the willingness of the lands, and also on the finance possibility. And our next two speakers are from member states, and I want to start with His Excellency Eng Essa Al-Hashmi. He's the Assistant Undersecretary of the Sustainable Community Sector at the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment. My question is, as already mentioned in the presentation from Hasib, is that UAE, you have a very ambition, you are one of the member states who really have food loss and waste as a target in the NDCs. It would be really interesting for us to listen what makes you bringing food loss and waste in the NDCs, but also what are the challenges and what do you want to see? There is the NDC partnership. So maybe also a message on this context. So over to you, His Excellency.
Thank you, Martina, and I would like to also thank WWF for hosting us today and the World Food Program for bringing us all together in here. And for us to better understand why we have incorporated food systems in our NDC, it's the fact that UAE is importing about 90% of its food. So when we look at scope 1 and scope 2 of emissions, we do notice that the UAE have limited emissions that are generated from those areas. So the food that we import usually results in emission throughout the lateral stages of the supply chain, and mainly it turns into waste. And this is where food loss and waste is the major contributor to emissions that comes from the agriculture sector. Now, we revised our NDC, we did all our modeling work this year, we raised our ambition. We could have even gone further, but we did notice that a slight change in an emission factor that of the methane, the latest one issued by IPCC, it impacted us a lot. So this is where we have prioritized now food loss and waste as a significant element in our NDC. In our NDC, we target to reduce food loss and waste by 50%, and we also target to reduce generation of food waste and loss and slash that by less than half of what's being produced. Now, to do this, we are capitalizing on some benefits that COVID-19 brought. One of the benefits of COVID-19 is that we have more conscious societies, communities around food. We have seen food not available in many developed nations during this crisis, and we have seen people appreciating food more. And we are building on that narrative in order to reinforce this and sustain that practice. With that being said, the leadership has issued NEMA, which is the National Food Waste and Loss Reduction Program. It tackles behavioral approaches of communities, and it builds on those small tweaks that we need to do in order for us to be able to reduce food loss and waste. And we were also very proud that in the latest UNEP report assessing food loss and waste, the UAE has reduced significantly its waste generation per capita from 195 kg per capita to 95 kg per capita. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think what is also important, especially on the target on food loss and waste, that this is closely connected to the SDG. It's SDG target 12.3, so that's also something, and I think Julia mentioned it also, to building the bridge between the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the NDCs. And another bridge we have to build, and I now want to introduce Veronica, is how could we connect the overall approaches on NDCs, maybe even with the Coronia Joint Work on Agriculture. And Veronica is the head of Climate Change Unit in the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya, and she's really an expert following up the Coronivia process over the last years and deeply involved and also now listening in what's happening there. Do you see a chance, or how do you see the possible linkage or integration or building the bridge between the NDCs and the hopefully positive outcome and future of Coronivia? Over to you, Veronica.
Thank you so much. The NDC and the outcomes of the Coronivia Joint Work on Agriculture are directly linked at the national level. This is because the NDC process, if I have to take the example of Kenya, is involved it integrates the priority sectors. And priority sectors, I mean those sectors that have a high vulnerability to the impacts of climate change, and also they have potential to cause climate change in terms of emitting greenhouse gases. And so agriculture is identified as one of those priority sectors in Kenya because of its vulnerabilities to the impacts of climate change, and it's also able to cause greenhouse gas emissions. So the NDC making process or development process in Kenya involves all the sectors providing their inputs into the national process. So the chances are that, not chances, but the obvious thing is that the outcome, the KJWA outcomes, hopefully they will be positive. They will find their entry into the NDC through the sector, agriculture sector, integrating those outcomes within their policies, the sector plans, and also the sector projects, so that the discussions that we have had and the outcomes that have been proposed will then be integrated in the sector first, the national sector plans, and then they will find their way into the NDC process. And this then provides a clear way of implementation and also reporting on what we do on the we are going to implement the KJWA. So I find they are very direct. If we are implementing KJWA, we'll be implementing the NDC. And of course, in the NDC updating in 2025, then if we revise, which I believe we are going to do, if we revise our sector plans, our sector policies, then we will be able to revise our NDC, taking into consideration the outcomes of the KJWA. And I believe that is what happens in the other countries. The issue here is then, if whatever we have put in the KJWA will easily find its way into the Kenyan NDC when we agree. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's really important to once again stress that it's so important that the negotiation will be ended with a positive result, and that we have an ongoing of the Coronivia, because this all is connected together. If we would lose this process in the UNFCCC convention, it would also have negative impacts on the NDCs. And I hope, and you know that WWF and our partners, we are really very much engaged in hopefully bringing and having positive results at the end of this week. I want now to introduce our fourth panelist. It's Freeman Olulu. He's the founder and of the Center Coordinator of African Center of Actions and Rural Development of ACCRD initiative. And Freeman, maybe if I have introduced it a little bit not in the right way, please correct me. I want a little bit to know, you are a young entrepreneur working with young people. What is your view on the national determined contributions, and maybe what are benefits for you, or why it's important to have strong NDCs in your country?
All right, thank you very much, and also thank you for this opportunity. Well, I want to actually first commend the FAO and the WWF for the efforts they are trying to make integrating the food systems into the NDCs, which is quite good and right. But we have a little bit of concern. Where we are is not the development of policies or documents. The problem has always been implementation of some of these NDCs. Now, if food system or the food waste, for example, is accounting up to 33%, that shows it's really huge and massive. And I can understand that countries like Vietnam, for example, that is into a lot of food waste, it could be more than that. So let me come back to Africa and the NDCs. Let me look at the role of young people in NDCs. Now, in the process of developing these country NDCs, how many young persons were part of this process? Now, for example, Nigeria has said 20% we can do on our own, 45% if we get international support. A country like Kenya is 32. They need over 79% if you can support us. Now, Nigeria has updated, and from what Our Excellency said they will update. The question is, how far have we gone in achieving that food sectorial or the food chain NDC that have been previously developed. So my concern is for young people and for local community, what are some of the infrastructures, what are some of the advancements that the country internally, for us we feel, you ask for support, it is two-way. I'll do my part, the international community does its part. But my concern is, and for the young people, what we feel and what we see is, what are we doing? I go back to Nigeria. If I generate my waste, for example, I have a waste manager because I stay in a place that's a little bit exclusive. They will take them. I have tried to trace where this waste ends. It's in the rivers, waterways. But I pay heavily just to get that waste off. Then there are some places you don't even have this kind of facilities. You throw them on the street, they burn them. So what I'm trying to say is, the document is fine, but we need to start looking forward to the actions, implementation. This is our concern, sectorially. So finally, I want to say this also. If you look at the design of the NDCs, it's very, very progressive. It is good if we go. For countries like Nigeria, if you say you design an NDC that is of a national implementation, it's not going to work in a country like Nigeria. So we have to look at how it works in the country. Nigeria has 36 states and one federal capital. The states need to domesticate every document developed that is taking ownership. So if they don't take ownership, that document developed doesn't work. So we need to start looking at holistically, not just paperwork, updating it. Let's try to see how they are making progress with the document, and the updating, try to look deep and let multi-stakeholder participate in the process, and young people could play an important role, and communities. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also for pointing out how important it is that this is not a top-down but a bottom-up process, and that this multi-stakeholder integration of those who will implement at the end the measures have to be asked and have to be integrated in all the development of all the plans and everything. And I think especially once again what you emphasize is, especially on food loss and waste, there could be a lot of things still done. I think not only in your countries, it's also in the rest of the world where we are still not very good in reduction of food loss and of food waste. Before I will open the Q&A, I have one last question to each of you. And if you could answer in a Twitter length, this means maximum, I don't know how many characters, but let's say it very short. And my question is just, what would make you happy if you leave the COP after these 2 weeks, maybe in context with the NDCs and the overall food system topic?
Well, I would be very happy, apart from it's very happy to see all of you and also the Cornevia joint work on agriculture family, as we call it. So that's all the agriculture negotiator, to have a clear ask, no? To have a clear ask to the COP, to the constituent bodies within the UNFCCC, but also to the outside society in terms of governments, in terms of financial institutions, to increase climate finance for agriculture and agri-food systems concerns, what you just mentioned as a gentleman. But keep in mind, if countries don't ask what they need, and they say this is a priority, the international community cannot respond. You need to ask it. You cannot just put it under, we need more climate action and finance. We've been saying that for the last couple of years. It doesn't work. You need to be clear. Thanks.
Just go around, yes. Freeman, again.
So, leaving COP, I would want to see clear commitment and a more diverse, multi-stakeholder collaboration. I would like to see a situation whereby we just don't come to COP and talk, or maybe gather in conferences. We need to raise awareness on the food system, the waste, and also see how the awareness go down to the people in the grassroots. We need to tell people that your habit needs to change, the way you dispose of your waste, and your action as a person, how it contributes. So we need more sensitization, knowledge sharing. Then we should find a way to also hold individual government, not to account in this case, but at least encourage them to put facilities in place and how to dispose it at this final disposal of some of these waste. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Martina, and I wouldn't add much, but I would love to see that such interdependent subjects, such as food systems, are framed in a way that we can include those in the NDCs, the same way that we did energy and industry, as well as other aspects. So framing food systems and how could it be added and addressed in the NDC is something that we would love to see as an outcome from this conference, to help nations in better addressing food systems in their upcoming NDCs. And the last thing is that I would love to see all the food waste that is generated from this event being treated in a climate smart way and diverted away from landfill. Thank you.
Thank you. Veronica.
Thank you. The first thing, I will agree with Julia that we all want a positive outcome from the Coronavirus joint work on agriculture, because we need implementation to take place, because farmers and other, even consumers of food are suffering as we continue to talk. So the first thing we want is to see an outcome that is going to facilitate implementation of the outcomes of the discussions. When we address the issues of agriculture, and of course because agriculture is focusing on ensuring there is food security, then we are going to be looking at the food systems. However, also agriculture will also depend on the outcomes of other processes that are happening in the discussions in this forum, and so in the COP. And so again, we would also like to also see positive outcomes from other streams like adaptation, mitigation, capacity building, because what we require is the technologies, the capacities, and also finance for the outcomes of Coronavirus to be implemented, and for us to be able to move towards a food secure environment that looks at all the aspects of food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. And we have time. I think it's very good. And my personal wish is that at the next COP we will even more, and we have a representative of the UAE. We will even have food even more present and more in the focus of the presidency program, and outside also in the pavilion. So we are looking ahead UAE 28. We will have time for one question. Is there any questions from the panel?
Thank you. So it's really interesting to see how NDC and food system are linked. But when you look at the NDC for some countries like Madagascar, for example, it's more a list of will that is project-based, not really a contribution from the country. And when we talk about food system, it needs to be driven locally, not based on those systems. So how do you think we can link NDC food system, but as well loss and damage, because a country like Madagascar are facing a lot of loss and damage, and we can plan for NDC for 5 years, but we are not planning for loss and damage in those, especially for food system. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the question had two parts, right? One was how food system measures that, or food system related projects that are happening on the ground, how can they make their way into the NDC? I think for that we need, as the panelists also pointed, a bottom-up approach in how we develop policies. So including all stakeholders at the community level, regional level, in the developing of measures that will be included in the NDC. Some countries, some NDCs are doing. For example, if you look at the NDC of Cambodia, they have a long list of projects that are implementing. Those come from the projects that are being implemented on the ground, and through coordination across ministries and government bodies that work in different sectors. So we need bottom-up approach, cross-sectoral coordination in developing NDCs to make sure that what we are already doing on the ground is counted as part of what we want to achieve under our NDCs. It's true that some countries are missing out. I'm sure a lot of countries are doing a lot of things on their food, but those measures and policies or those programs and projects don't make it to NDC and are not reflected in the NDC. The question on loss and damage and how we can include that in the NDC, that's a bit, I think, a big question. We'll see how the whole, thankfully it made it to the agenda, so the negotiations are ongoing. We'll see if there will be any promises from the global north countries to start paying for the losses that the global south countries have suffered because of climate change. And I think once that's agreed, there are ways to include that as part of achieving the NDC targets. I'm not sure how that will, maybe, Julia, you would like that?
Not that I have a solution to offer. So in some way the question goes back to you, no? So because NDCs are what countries say they want to do or need to have as gaps, capacity financing gaps. So it will depend on countries. I also like to flag that agriculture, loss and damage, etc., will come up again from a reporting point of view under the enhanced transparency framework, right? So their country, again, they decide what they will report. And this is really important. So, for example, there's a whole group organized in the capacity hub, the capacity building around the Paris Agreement, the ETF. I think that's something really to track in terms of what is then coming up in terms of the reporting. Because you need to close the cycle, no? It's not just what is in the NDC, it's actually what is then reported back in terms of advancement. So, and also financing gaps. I just wanted to make that the point because sometimes we forget about closing the cycle.
Thank you. And we have a very strict, we have to have a hard stop at 10. I want to thank my panel. It was amazing listening to you, and I hope you will continue to work with us on the NDCs. And I want to hand over now to Pablo Vieira. He's the Global Director of the NDC Partnership, and I think especially the last question was what's happening on the ground and what could the national governments do and the national constituencies in a multi-stakeholder process to implement the NDCs. And we are very happy listening to you and doing the closing of this session.
Thank you very much. I'll stand here. No, Martina, please stay. Thank you, Martina, and thank you, everyone. This was really exciting, and I want to start by thanking the invitation to come and listen to you and to have the opportunity to close today. I think the perspectives that were shared were fundamental. And listen, this is my 7th COP, and I've never seen so much food. Not the one you eat, but the one you talk about, ever in a COP. And that's really, really good news. It's very encouraging. I think a lot more can be done and more visibility should be done. But I think that both what we're seeing at COP and what was presented about the report is showing progress in terms of how food is becoming fundamental when we talk about climate action. Of course, food systems are incredibly dynamic, and we know what we eat has a profound impact on our health and the health of this planet. The numerous links between our food systems and the Paris Agreement are becoming clearer and clearer by the day. And of course, the complexity that they bring are also becoming more and more clear as we move forward. So I appreciate very much the contributions of the report. I think it's very important to bring together information that tells us how we're moving forward in bringing food into the NDCs, and of course how this links also with finance and the availability of resources to better implement those actions on the ground. Because one of the main challenges that countries have is that they need a lot of resources to be able to implement these actions. So putting them in the NDCs is the beginning. Then you need to engage with the communities, you need to bring it down to the territory, and you need finance to be able to implement those actions. So that's a lot of the work that's coming forward as we move to implementation. With a third of the emissions coming from food systems, the potential for mitigation is tremendous, but we also need to be very mindful of the importance of food and the transformation of the food systems in adaptation, and making sure that we're building more resilient systems, because it's also one of the main sources of issues around adaptation and lack of resilience. So that's a very important element. From the NDC partnership, I have the benefit of drawing on insights from our more than 80 countries that are engaged in understanding specifically how they're seeing food and food systems in their process of implementing their NDCs, and then how they can find potential ways of raising ambition around food. The complex and connected nature of the systems means that they're cutting across many systems, many sectors, as you pointed out. So it's difficult to make a specific analysis, but I can tell you of the more than 4,000 requests that we have received, 3% specifically mention food. It doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually very significant. It's more than, for example, tourism, twice as much. So that means that it's there, but it's also because it's embedded into sector requests. But I can tell you that when we supported countries update their NDCs in the lead up to Glasgow, we supported 67 countries. And then food and agriculture was 17% of the requests. So that shows how maybe in the first round wasn't there. In implementation, it's still a challenge, but it's raising its visibility in the new NDCs, and it's becoming more important. 39 of the 67 countries that we supported included specific targets and increased their ambition around food and agriculture. So that is very important. And that's also part of the question. Some of the things that we supported went beyond just the analysis, in terms of what are the needs, what are the targets. It included a lot of consultation processes, making sure that these NDCs were not only more ambitious, but also higher quality, which means that people on the ground were involved in the determination of these targets. So they're now involved in the implementation of those targets, and that's fundamental in this process. Of course, there's many other things that are involved in the food systems, transport, energy, agriculture, water, follow waste, industry, tourism, and fisheries all have direct links to food in the requests that we're receiving, and that's very important because we're looking at the full value chain, and that is a systemic approach to this, which is fundamental. So identifying the most strategic interventions and opportunities to leverage co-benefits is a critical element. And of course, we work very closely with our partners, and we have 3 of them today here. So that's very, very encouraging. And hopefully next year we'll have you join the partnership also as the COP presidency. So you're invited. But the challenges need to be turned into opportunities. And that's to your point. Involving people on the ground, turning those commitments into actions on the ground, mobilizing finance, policy frameworks that allow the ground to move is fundamental. So with more than 200 members, the partnership is ready to continue collaborating with all of you and bringing this to the forefront of the action on the ground. But we need to work together, and this is why it's so important to have these conversations, because we need to start at the government level, we need to mobilize finance, we need to bring the private sector, we need to link all these different sectors, and that requires collaboration. And that is the main objective of the NDC partnership. By working together, we can achieve more, and my invitation is to continue moving forward, and we're very happy to provide support to countries and to bring different partners together in bringing that support to a reality. So thank you again for the invitation, and congratulations.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you once again for this excellent panel and for your input. As we have heard, the time is now. We need actions. We need to go on the ground. NDCs will stay a topic for WWF, for Climate Focus, for Global Alliance. And just for your information, we will start to work on a tool with measures for food systems in the NDCs, which is hopefully financed by the German government, but this is, and hopefully to present it then at the COP 28 in UAE. Thanks a lot, have a nice day, and see you in one of the other events. Just the speaker, could you make a joint photo with the panel?